And before Dr. Anderson starts, I want to present Dr. Anderson with a First D t-shirt. We hope that you'll wear that in good style. Get my stuff out of your way.
There we go. Good morning. I want to make sure that I'm able to be heard here. So I first want to thank Catherine McGuire for inviting me to First Existentialist, and then to all of you for taking the time to listen. Two things before I start. One, I just want to let you all know that the very nice and generous speaking fee will be going to an organization called l'Arche. It's L'Arche, which is an international organization that creates homes where people with intellectual disabilities and people without disabilities live together in community. And there are 2 houses here in Atlanta, so the speaking fee will be going to that. The second is I'm used to talking to classes. I'm used to speaking to professional philosophy organizations and faculty meetings. This is my first time ever speaking to a church congregation. So hopefully what I have to say will make some sense. This morning, I want to talk about disability and being human. Specifically, how people with cognitive disabilities might be a part of the human moral community. As my bio will tell you, I'm a professor of philosophy, and my scholarship focuses on Jean-Paul Sartre and the question of disability. I first want to give a little background to put my interest in this topic into context. I was exposed to disability of many sorts from early on in my life. My father had a physical disability, and my mother worked at a school for children with intellectual and physical disabilities. Many times I went to the school with my mother to visit with the kids, or they would come to our house, so I got to know a few of the children fairly well. All of the children she worked with lived in an institution where the residents lived out their lives. When I went off to college, I encountered in my very first semester the 2 philosophers who would shape my thinking from then on, René Descartes and Jean-Paul Sartre. Descartes, of course, is famous for the claim, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. Self-consciousness, he thinks, proves my existence as a thinking thing. Sartre was attractive to me for his insistence on our radical freedom and total responsibility for our actions. His thought is most neatly summed up in his formulation of what it means to be human: existence precedes essence. In short, what we actually do in the world is how we define ourselves and create our essence. How we choose to exist makes us who and what we are. Both of these philosophers profess the idea that what it means to be human is, fundamentally, our self-consciousness and the freedom of thought and action that results from it. This struck me as true of the core of my own being and my way of interacting with the world and other people. And yet, from that very first encounter with philosophy as an exploration of freedom and consciousness, I could not help but wonder about those people I had come to know that would not fit into this mold. If someone could not, a la Descartes, say to themselves, I think, therefore I am, it seemed that this particular mind might not be human. In a similar way, for Sartre, if a person was not radically free because they were not fully self-conscious, then they would not be able to have that self-created human essence. They would not be counted as human in quite the same way as someone who did have this freedom. Although these concerns stayed with me as I pursued philosophy as an undergraduate, I did not explore these questions in any explicit way. During the year before I started graduate school here at Emory, I worked at the institution where my mother's students lived. I was in charge of the boys' side of cabin 3. We called it the boys' side, even though the residents ranged in age from early adolescence to some in their late 50s. I was responsible for all aspects of care, mostly physical, but also emotional and disciplinary. The range of disabilities was quite broad. Some residents could not talk, while others did so incessantly. Many were confined to wheelchairs due to cerebral palsy or spina bifida, and a large number had Down syndrome. Some of my boys had never in their life uttered a word or done much more than follow where they were led and perhaps play with toys or watch TV. I got to know my boys pretty well, to see their limitations, what made them happy, what made them angry. They all had severe enough cognitive disabilities that I recognized early on that none of them would ever be able to leave an institutional setting like this one. The residents there were never going to get jobs or live independently. This very small world was their life. During graduate school at Emory, my concerns about disability were mostly left behind in the sheer volume of other philosophy that I had to master. Apart from the occasional argument over what it means to be human and why most of what we were studying fell short on that count, I did not pursue the question of disability in any detailed way. However, soon after graduating, my interest in studying disability from an existential perspective was piqued again when I came across a posthumously published lecture on ethics Sartre gave, in which he goes into some detail about an incident that occurred in the late 50s in the poor industrial city of Liège, Belgium. A group of mothers there committed infanticide on their children who had been born with severe deformities due to the drug thalidomide. I assume most of us are familiar with the scandal surrounding thalidomide, but very briefly, it was a poorly tested drug prescribed to expectant women to relieve morning sickness in the late 50s. The drug caused deformities of limbs and internal organs, and many babies died soon after birth. The drug was ultimately banned for use, but not before causing a lot of damage. In the incident in question, the mothers had killed their babies in an act of protest against the drug company that produced the drug and, in a larger context, the industrial system that was indifferent to human life and valued profits over public safety. Sartre grapples with understanding what the mothers' actions meant and how they expressed a certain kind of morality. I thought I had found what I was looking for, an existentialist examination of the ethics of disability. But I need to say that my initial reaction was one of disappointment. I finally came across a Sartrean exploration of disability, and I find him defending acts of infanticide from an existential perspective. For Sartre, the trait that makes us human is our rationality and the radical freedom that results from self-consciousness. As a result, the limits of the moral community, those who are considered human and worthy of moral consideration, are others who can share in this rationality and freedom. On this view, the place of people with severe cognitive and physical handicaps is problematic, as we don't expect them to be defining themselves or to be entertaining thoughts of the moral code or their duties to others. If they are deemed worthy of moral consideration, they might be so only because they are part of the human species and are sentient to some extent, but not because they function as full members of the community of free moral agents. From this perspective, the infanticides might make a kind of sense, since the disabled infants could be seen as not fully human, and thus not improperly, if perhaps reluctantly, used as a vehicle for protest. This was my initial reading of Sartre's approach. I thought he was just applying his early existentialist ideas to a particular example. I found, however, on deeper reflection, that he was doing something very different. Sartre's existentialism, and thus his ethics, had shifted in a significant way. Sartre's early existentialism focused on individual consciousness with radical freedom, where we are constantly in a battle with other people to assert our own definition of ourselves and of the world. This is the Sartre of the play No Exit, which has one of its characters proclaim the infamous phrase, "Hell is other people." On this early view, any ethical principles would come from an individualistic consciousness fighting to create itself. What I found was really going on in this late example of the Liège infanticides was a shift from an exclusive focus on freedom and self-consciousness as the basis of ethics to a focus on human need as the root of ethics. Instead of an ethics aimed solely at the expansion of individual freedom, this new focus on need aims to insist on the centrality of the satisfaction of our human needs and ultimately on human flourishing. You might say, instead of insisting on individual human freedom, he now insists on humans living freely. Sartre recognizes that a human being is much more than freedom, and the new goal is what he calls integral humanity. Integral humanity is the fulfillment of the human organism in all its dimensions. The things that satisfy our organic needs are what we experience as having to be obtained in order to live a fully human life, and it is these needs, not freedom, that we experience as a moral demand. Need is basically a feeling for what I currently lack. Such needs are built into our very nature and include the need for protein and oxygen, obviously, but also the need for culture, communication, knowledge, love, and a meaningful life. Sartre still sees that humans have that fundamental core of existential freedom, our self-consciousness, but that freedom is now seen as in the service of fulfilling this broad goal of human fulfillment. Instead of just needing to choose always to create and support freedom, one now must choose to create human wholeness or integral humanity. My freedom does not simply emerge from a place of abstract self-consciousness, defining itself in the world against other people. My freedom now is a response to the needs emerging from the world in which I find myself, needs that are both my own and those of others. To address those needs, I am called on in a new way that demands even more of my freedom. I want to look again at the infanticides and then add another example that will take these Sartrean ideas in a new direction. With respect to the Liège infanticides, to understand the mother's actions, Sartre asks us to sympathize with the terrible situation in which they found themselves. These mothers, and indeed all the working poor, in Sartre's terms, were living subhuman lives, oppressed by an industrial and economic system that barely allowed them to fulfill their basic needs, let alone anything like human flourishing. The deformed infants appeared to these mothers as representative of their own difficult lives, stark manifestations of the impossibility of being human. These women chose to struggle against their own subhuman condition by destroying these subhuman creatures. These women act in recognition of the potential future beyond the current system. It was not that the mothers were using their children as non-human objects to express their anger. The mothers themselves were less than fully human. Both the mothers and the children were leading subhuman lives. The infanticides, then, were a kind of sacrifice of current subhumanity for the sake of a better future. Sartre tells us that these mothers had some sense of what a better life could be, a more human existence, in a future beyond the current social structures that condemned them to subhumanity. They could feel that they were lacking a fully human life. They could feel the need for humanity that was not choked by oppressive and inhuman relationships. Although perhaps misguided, the killing of their children was an act meant to help bring about that future. But my question remained, could these infants have a place in that hoped-for future? I think so, even if Sartre did not entertain this possibility himself. Sartre tells us that these women felt the need for a fully realized humanity and that their acts expressed the need for a humanity beyond current structures of industrial confinement and oppressive stratification. Following this idea, I would also propose a need for humanity beyond the structures of a narrow definition of an individual human life. In other words, just as integral humanity is perceived as fully realized human life beyond hierarchy and socially defined roles, might not the conception of a fully realized human life be expanded to permit roles not normally conceived within the narrow boundaries of classical philosophy? And this is where I want to introduce the ideas of another philosopher, Eva Feder-Kete, who writes about her daughter, Sesha. Although some would maintain that the severely cognitively disabled lack everything necessary for moral consideration, self-consciousness, responsiveness to environment, social relations, creativity, knowledge, aesthetic pleasure, Kete objects that her own daughter, who would be classified as severely cognitively disabled, still enjoys music and family and friends. Referring to people like her daughter, Kete says, although not one of them will read Spinoza, another philosopher, the claim that these folks are incapable of deep personal relationships or deep aesthetic pleasures could not be further from the truth. While we cannot guess to what extent any particular person with such disabilities might have the freedom to create a vision of their own future, it is certainly the case that the parent or the caregiver has these concerns about the future for the child. Since the child cannot fully envision its own future must be envisioned by the caregiver and include others who will be related to the satisfaction of that particular future. This would be a future predicated on the love of the parent and would result in a kind of cooperative need, a need which can only be satisfied by both people together. This would be a kind of intimate human flourishing within the larger structure of integral humanity. Kate tells us that while rationality and the capacity to determine one's own good are useful to being part of a moral community, she doubts whether either is necessary. She recognizes, along with Sartre, that an essential aspect of moral life is the quality of relationships, for instance, love. But she contends that some people may bring joy and love to others even if they themselves do not recognize this. Speaking again of her daughter, Kate says whether or not she knows what it means to determine her own good is in doubt, but what is not in doubt is the good she brings into the world. Although Sesha, her daughter, has no measurable IQ, Kate tells us that she does have the capacity for joy and affection. She is fully human, not a vegetable. Given the scope and breadth of human possibilities and capacities, she occupies a limited spectrum, but she inhabits this spectrum fully because she has the most important faculties of all, the capacities for love and for happiness. Love, says Kate, is what Sesha wishes to receive, and that is what she reciprocates in spades. She is fully human, but also fully dependent. While we might say that the usual aim of parental love is to provide the child with the means to act toward a future of independence and fully realized humanity, in the special case of the severely cognitively disabled, this future is structured as a joint venture between the caregiver and the child. In light of this, and the ethics Sartre imagines, I would propose that the cognitively disabled, Kate's daughter Sesha, my boys from cabin 3, I would propose that the cognitively disabled reveal aspects of the world and of human possibility otherwise unavailable to us. These fully dependent, loving human persons introduce possibilities that may be alien to me as an isolated individual, but which, in relationship, expand my experience. These people demand even more of my own freedom by imposing additional responsibilities through a situation of utter dependency. And in other late work, Sartre tells us that joy comes from being open to the truth. He says, I may have understood the truth of the world in its totality, but still all of it remains to be understood. There is joy in expanding the boundaries of what remains to be understood and in recognizing the extent of my ignorance by way of an honest confrontation with the human in all its manifestations. This existentialist ethics of radical freedom and absolute responsibility embraces an expansive moral community that can include people of all abilities and needs. I thank you for your time and attention.